All right, so for the sake of time, I will start on the hour. Welcome everyone to this GCDN conversation session, part of our long-running series of such conversations that we've been hosting for the last year. Many speakers, many themes, so we're really glad to have you here. Tonight's theme is same old, brand new. Have we simply gone back to business as usual? And the panel will, engage in the question as to whether the global pandemic has truly enabled any innovations in the way we operate. The person who is going to lead us through this conversation is Michael Woodsmall. Michael is the strategic development manager at Y, an architecture firm based in California and New York, and they have joined GCDN as an affiliate member back in November of last year, I think. So we've asked them to come in and share some insights on this and drive this conversation. Michael, I will hand over to you to present your panel, and I will disappear from the screen. So
thank you, Greg.
A great conversation.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And thank you everyone for joining today. Really excited to be moderating this incredible group of panelists. We have Elizabeth Ann McGregor, Shauna Weeks, and Theodore Nipping. I will go into greater detail about each of them momentarily, but to start, what we're really going to be talking about today is, I think, first and foremost, confronting COVID and what that experience was like for all of us organizationally and collectively. And basically, what were the pressing pain points, and what were the opportunities those pain points presented for us navigating these problems, these obstacles that in many ways were our longstanding reality, things that were just pushed to the forefront by COVID and the impacts of lockdown, et cetera. And then I really want to turn the conversation to looking forward. Optimistically, obviously, is lockdown and quarantine and all those restrictions decrease, we're kind of entering an opportunity here, an opportunity to look forward, optimistically work together, and really establishing an infrastructure or platform that will allow us to better navigate these sorts of situations in the future and potentially build a more sustainable model for each of us individually as well as collectively. My name, as Greg said, is Michael Woodsmall. I'm with Y Architecture. We are architects and designers, and we're mainly known for our cultural portfolio. We've done a number of museums in our spaces, including private residences for art collectors. But recently we've expanded to include performing arts, creative campuses, cultural districts. And while we are architects and designers, we also see ourselves as facilitators and ambassadors of cultural conversation. We connect stakeholders around the world as we coax our networks out of complacency, shepherding them from inspiration and ideation to the actualization and eventual execution of vision. One of our main focuses recently, and a reason why we're so excited to be a part of this roundtable, is at the intersection of culture and commerce, and where we support and advise on everything from strategy, branding and identity, programming to design and architecture, to ongoing operations after the fact, making sure that we really maintain a presence in our offering holistic services that really, I think, zero in on this idea of sustainability financially and otherwise. And again, I'm really honored to be here with these panelists. I'll first introduce Elizabeth Ann McGregor, or Liz Ann McGregor. Liz Ann is presently the director at the Museum of Contemporary Arts in Australia, where she took over in 1999. Now, she took over when the MCA in Sydney was struggling both financially and on a perception front. And through kind of arriving there, she started developing strategies that challenged public and political perceptions of contemporary art and the museum. And excitingly, this resulted in a new funding model, which I'm sure she can speak a little bit more to. In 2012, that culminated in a major rebuilding, including the National Center of Creative Learning, which allowed for greater impact with regards to social impact in those initiatives. And in 2019, MCA was named as the highest attended museum of contemporary art in the world by the art newspaper, which I think we can all get behind and get excited about as a beacon of what is possible. And I think otherwise, she's got a number of recognitions, but one I really wanted to point out was she was recently appointed the chairman of the federal government Creative Economy Task Force, which again, I think is very relevant for this conversation. She's also received the OBE, the Queen's Birthday Honors in 2011, and been named Australia's Businesswoman of the Year back in 2008. But Lizanne, I'd love an opportunity to hear a little bit more about yourself from yourself.
Thank you very much, Michael. Actually, the bit of the story that you missed, which is quite important, is that I began my career as a bus driver. I took a traveling gallery around Scotland, and that actually, in all seriousness, is what ignited my passion for engaging audiences with contemporary art in particular. And that really has been what has driven me here at the museum. And I must admit, when I first arrived and audiences had dropped below 100,000 a year, I could not in my wildest dreams have imagined that we would ever get to 1 million. And I think we've done it in a number of ways. One is we have a really strong focus on working with living artists, which gives us that possibility to bring artists into everything that we do, consulting them, but also involving them. Our donor base just love being able to come along and meet the artist. And so having that focus on the living and not worrying about the dead is actually been a really great strength for us. And I would say the other thing is that we don't compromise the program because we want to engage with a broad audience. Right from the beginning, you mentioned perception, and in fact, shifting the perception of the museum, which was famously described as the gallery that nobody goes to, great gallery, shame about the art. And my favorite headline, which was money for wankers, when the government gave us some money. So we had to shift that perception. And to do that, we really wanted to make it clear that contemporary art can and should be accessible for all. And that your postcode does not determine whether, or even your level of education, doesn't determine whether you will or not enjoy a visit to a contemporary art museum. And so for a lot of people, the idea of a contemporary art museum, 20 years ago was a kind of scary thing. It's not for me, it's for, it's for rich people, or it's intimidating. And I remember feeling that myself as an art history student going to contemporary museums. And the things I learned on the bus were really important. The importance of making people feel welcome, not using exclusive language in the way we talk about the art. The ideas are complex and should be. We pride ourselves, one of our slogans is we make challenging art accessible. We don't change the art, but we do talk about it in the same way as you would have a conversation with an artist when a curator visits a studio, for example. And we try to make visitors feel that it can be part of their lives. And importantly, not, you don't have to like everything. And so these have been some of our ways of trying to promote the museum, which is what led finally, after quite an interesting up and down, including one proposal to knock the building down and rebuild it, which wasn't my favorite option. Eventually, we were able to negotiate some core funding from the state government. We were, just to those of your viewers who don't know, we were originally set up by the University of Sydney. So we had core funding from the university for the first 5 or 6 years before I joined, but that money had run out, and that was really what caused the financial crisis. But in order to get the money from the government to replace that, we had to address these poor perceptions. And I think it's true to say that's true of politics everywhere. It doesn't matter what side of politics, that if you're not able to show that you can demonstrate that you're there for the public good and not just for, a bunch of artists and their friends, then you're never going to get accepted into the political arena. But that, of course, then allowed us to develop other sources of income, greater philanthropy, more sponsorship, and something I'm very keen on, which is our venues business. And I'll talk more later, because that was the thing that I always said. We can tweak it, we can move it, it's a business, we can change the model a bit. We also have offices that we have, some of the building that we have rented out, so rent. So these were meant to be our solid core income. And in COVID, for the first time, in a way that I could never have imagined, that changed because companies couldn't pay their rents. And we all know what happened to hospitality. So What was a very, very great strength of ours up until 18 months ago suddenly became a weakness. So that's probably a bit of an overview for you for now.
Thank you so much, Lizanne. And I'd also like to add that we are absolutely honored to have you here, as Lizanne has recently announced that she'll be stepping down from her role as director of MC after 20 years. So thank you so much for joining us. It's an honor to have you as maybe one of your last panels as the director of NCAA.
Very possibly.
So thank you so much. Next, it's an absolute honor to introduce Shauna Weeks. She's the manager communication and programming government, manager of communications and programming for the Perth Theatre Trust in Western Australia. And that includes His Majesty's Theatre, Subiaco Arts Centre, State Theatre Centre of Western Australia, and the Albany Entertainment Centre. And, not only does she work with those venues, but those venues are home, temporary or otherwise, to a number of local, national, and international performance groups and individuals. And really honored to have Shauna here, and really excited to have her here as someone who's just so central to communications between so many different organizations and really a conduit of collaboration in a lot of ways. So thank you for joining us, Shauna. But we'd love to hear a little bit more about what you all have been focusing on and what this last year has been like.
Thanks so much. It's such an honour to be here, actually. And I do need to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land I'm on today, which is the Whadjuk Noongar people. And I pay my respects to the elders, past and present. So the Perth Theatre Trust, which I'll probably refer to from this point on as PTT because it's easier. Yes, the venues that you mentioned, we do have those, but what's probably really interesting about us as well is that we actually have regional venues as well. And WA is a massive state in Australia. So 2 of our venues are actually 500 kilometres from Perth in different directions. So some of the challenges for us across COVID has not just been trying to negotiate a number of art centres or theatres within the capital city construct, but also the regional venues. And because we've moved in and out of lockdown phases, what happens is sometimes what we're doing in the capital city is not what we're doing in the regional venues. So there's been a lot of trying to negotiate who's where, what messaging do they need, what kind of challenges are they facing, and particularly for the regional venues, things that we could never have anticipated. No touring product has actually nearly brought them completely to a standstill. So there was a real opportunity for us in some ways across COVID about what does it mean to be West Australian. So the Perth Theatre Trust's a government agency, we're a statutory body, and one of our principal responsibilities is to West Australian theatre. So the reason that the government supports these venues is actually to support Western Australian product, Western Australian artists, to reflect our stories back at ourselves. But it's not something we've done particularly exceptionally or consistently. So there was this moment in time for us where we went, well, how do you fill a theatre when you have no product coming in? So that for the last year has been, or the last nearly 2 years now, has been where we've kind of had to turn our head. And because we have those resident companies, because we have companies that are housed in our buildings and they create 40% of our product, it was also about, well, they've stopped working, they're funded by government, now what happens? So it's been about how do we transform the funding that we get and the assets that we have to actually create
Did Shauna freeze for everyone else on screen?
Yes.
Yeah. We'll give her a moment to get back on, but in the interest of time and to just keep this conversation moving forward, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our last panelist here, who is Theo Nipping. Theo is the founder and managing partner at Plus Curiosity. It is a creative studio that's based out of both Tokyo and LA that focuses on placemaking and bringing physical spaces to life. They work closely with real estate developers, property owners, and retailers. Clients include Ginza 6, Sumitomo Corporation, the Japan Retail Fund. In many ways, they act as a conduit between the cultural sector and commercial ventures, and really a champion in both directions, really trying to help facilitate relationships and understandings of how the two can work together to strike that balance while also preserving their separate integrity and their kind of visions and model. But Theo, thank you so much for joining us this morning as well. Would love to kind of give you an opportunity to speak a little bit more about what you're focusing on, and really, I think, in the context of how that relates to the cultural sector that's well represented on the other side of today's conversation.
Well, thanks for having me, Michael. Elizabeth said she started as a bus driver. Well, I started as a commercial property broker, way back. And my job used to be bringing the likes of Apple or Tesla or Lululemon and helping them find shop space across Asia. So that was actually what I did. Hardly what I would call anything related, even remotely, to museums and culture and beautiful things. But as the years progressed, I started to see that what these shopping centers we typically would tenant, what they really needed was help after we signed Lululemon or Tesla or Apple. They were having more and more trouble sort of thinking of ways to bring people to these places. If they don't have people, the brands won't come and pay them rent because they don't think they can sell enough computers or polo shirts. So how do you bring people to places? It is an extremely, it's getting harder and harder as people get more and more comfortable on their sofa with their cell phone. I used to say, well, at least you have to go out and eat. But now there's something called Uber Eats, and they figured out how to bring overpriced but very good, hot, delicious food to your sofa. So the world was changing, and so a couple of years ago I decided to leave what I'm doing and focus more on helping the developers think of how to drive the way of thinking on how to bring more people and the programming to drive people. And I remember I had a really interesting chat with Theo, who used to run the Singapore National Museum. And she told me, hey, Theo, it's Theo and Theo. So she said, Theo, you and I are actually, we're fighting for the same person on Saturday afternoon. You want them to come to the mall. Well, I need them to come to my museum. So there's only so much time on a Saturday afternoon. Which are they going to pick? My museum or your mall? So I never actually thought of it. And that's why Theo from a long time ago was doing very interesting things like, working with interactive digital art and really thinking about interesting things that would drive traffic whilst still maintaining the integrity of the museum and its core purpose. In the beginning, developers were talking about stuff like food trucks and anime pop-ups. But now, especially for the higher end shopping centers or mixed use developments, there is an increasing interest in cultural content and even museums. So as I would maybe put it, like, I think there's probably concern from people in that side of the world, the museum side, as to how to maintain cultural and so the integrity of purpose when you have these grubby capitalists just looking at you as a, you know, as a conduit to just bringing more people. And we can go into this later, but I think there is a equilibrium which can be reached, which will ultimately help both sides, both halves, to drive more traffic. As I see it, without people, the retailers will go out of business, the shopping centers will go out of business. But as Elizabeth was saying, if you don't have people and interest from the public, you're not going to get the endowments either. So I think there is an equilibrium there into working together to drive more people. That's sort of what I'm working on, and I'm working on very interesting projects, which I can talk about a bit later.
Wonderful. Thank you, Theo. Sean, just in case no one else noticed, Shauna's internet died. We're trying to get her back on, but we're going to forge forward with the conversation.
When you live in Western Australia.
I was going to say something, but I wasn't sure if that was my place to say anything. But, you know, I think I really want to start by focusing on something we all touched on. And that's really what happened this last year and the pain points that came with it, right? For us, I think in our space, in our industry, a lot of our clients or creative partners or, you know, partners in general, what they really struggled with was, again, the fact that these traditional business models that had been reliable for them through, in many ways, thick and thin, no longer could, there was no more flexibility or buffer left here after this last year with lockdown. All of that was stripped. And what we saw was, you know, questions surrounding not only how do we fix this immediately? Obviously, people went to digital or X, Y, and Z. But you know what it really also surfaced were some fundamental problems, certain reliances on external inputs that were really exaggerated, I think, for this last year. And so I think I'd love for this to take this as an opportunity for, you know, starting with Lizanne, excuse me, over the last 20 years, you've navigated a number of situations, a number of circumstances that you know, could be described as catastrophic to a lot of people. But I think, you know, I'd love to start by understanding, how was this last year different for you guys? What were the pain points that really came, or maybe it wasn't as different as the other ones. Maybe it was just more exaggerated or extreme, but what were the pain points that you struggled with this last year?
The major pain point initially was seeing our income collapse. So $5 million of income comes from our venue hire business. That's using parts of the building that are not museum for parties and product launches and corporate, all that sort of stuff. So that is a venue's business, and it collapsed completely, gone. That's it. That was inconceivable before COVID. And the people who were renting other parts of the building, which I always thought was the solid piece of it, wanted rent rebates. So financially, overnight, I mean, in the GFC, we were able to tinker and shift the business away from corporates, which were suffering, towards weddings, which were never going to disappear. And, you know, take advantage of our fabulous, for those who don't know us, we're fabulously sited right opposite the Opera House. So you get your wedding photographs, you know, with the backdrop of the Opera House. So it's a very special site, and that is an enormous advantage for us. So that disappeared overnight. There was no tweaking, there was nothing, it just went. Now, fortunately, we built up reserves. We're a very, very cautious organization, having inherited it bankrupt. I had no intention of leaving it bankrupt. And so we had built up reserves. But then, of course, the discussion was, how much do you cut staff? You know, that was the biggest thing, was, do we now immediately try to preserve? What level of reserves is appropriate? How long is this going to go for? We were working, in the first weeks when it happened, we produced 16 different financial scenarios. I mean, it was insanity, and it was being driven by fear, I think, from the board that, we're going to run through the reserve too quickly, and you have to lay off all these staff. My philosophy was, we have to hold on to the staff. We really must do everything we can to keep the staff. And of course, what happened was that very quickly our government stepped in with JobKeeper. So we were able to preserve 90% of the staff. We lost quite a few casuals, but 90% of the staff. And for me, that was critical because it is the staff are what drives the museum. We have an incredible team, for example, of artist educators. We train artists to be educators. They are the ones that develop all these incredible social impact programs we do, from the under fives through to art and dementia. And that was the second problem for us. Okay, we had closed down. We had 3 months of closure. That was pretty bad. And what we were concerned about was how could we keep in touch with these groups that we had developed over the years, these amazing relationships in Western Sydney. So of course, like everybody, we switched to digital until we discovered that 40% of the primary children at the schools that we deal with in Western Sydney have no access to the internet. So that was a very serious challenge, that we were all assuming that we could communicate and keep our groups connected with us, because we were all concerned about this big C, the connection word. How could we do that when they did not have access to the internet? So we had to really think to strategize a whole different way. And essentially, I rang the Daily Telegraph, which is the biggest circulating newspaper, and asked if they were doing anything that we could contribute creative activities to, which would reach some of these families that we had been in dialogue with. And what transpired was that we provided the creative content for the newspapers, what they called their pullout for people doing activities to keep, everybody was going crazy homeschooling, for example. And so we created some other strategies. So it was very interesting, but at the same time, we had to go digital, do more. We were always doing digital, but do even more, amplify it. And then I guess the third factor was managing staff working from home, which continues, of course. And I think that's a very difficult conundrum for all of us, when so much about art is about being face-to-face with art. I am pleased to say that since we reopened, audiences have come flooding back. I don't think there's any problem demonstrating that people want and need culture. Our theatres are full. Every single time a theatre, announces a new production, it's sold out. It's actually been quite extraordinary. Look at Hamilton here. It's been totally sold out, as it has everywhere, but here in particular, it went so fast, and all the other theatres likewise. And us too. We're not back up to the full numbers because we haven't got the tourists, but we have got the local audiences back, and they are really thirsting for the cultural experience, to be in the gallery with real art and real people. It's the social experience again.
Absolutely.
So those are the three challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. Which of the challenges that you faced back then, and that you had, fixes to as people reintegrate and come back, has everything maintained with regard to your kind of patches and the fixes that you made, the course corrects that you made over the last year? Have you guys maintained kind of addressing those issues, whether it's through collaborations with the newspaper or things like that, or has it kind of gone back to business as usual? I think repeating the context of this conversation.
It's what everybody's calling it the hybrid museum. So there is no going back to the same, but there is no doubt that getting the children in particular back into the museum, getting people in front of art is what we do. So that has to be our core business. There is no point. However, learning how to provide access to artist studios, for example, with Zoom talks. I mean, I'm not sure we would have been doing this a year ago, 2 years ago. We would have been saying, oh, that's a video conference. Do we really do video conferences? Talking to our colleagues, learning how to do things easily, like Instagram chats. My director to director series, chatting with my colleagues around the world for 20 minutes, has been hugely successful. I think people really relish that. And all these things we're going to keep going if we can resource them. That's the big question, of course, is the resourcing. But ultimately, I really believe that the museum is a space where people come together. It's a space where people come for healing, to feel better. And this is leading us to rethink how we talk about the museum in the context of wellness. Not just mental health, but the whole of life, the well-being agenda that is now really coming to the fore as we come through COVID, knowing exactly what the devastation has been. Now, we were already doing this because of what happened with the bushfires last year. And we realized that the museum was seen as a place of refuge, a place to get away from the horrors that were happening around people. We had amazing feedback last year before COVID as we came through the bushfires, and we were beginning to set up projects in some of those hardest hit areas to take our artist educators there, not as art therapists, but actually as artists, but to artists who can engage with young people to tell their stories and therefore to come to terms with what's been happening to them. So this is something that we really think is an incredibly important learning and something we can build on, given our experience with social impact and creative learning.
Thank you. I definitely want to come back and actually talk a little bit about communications and marketing and amplifying all these changes in a moment. You already touched on that a little bit with the partnership that you established, but I think the venue for hire really stands out as obviously a major hole that just arrived, right? Theo, I feel like you can speak a little bit to that as well. From your perspective, what did you see as really elevated as issues that cultural sector had to address? Speaking to your commercial clients and partners or ventures as well, what was kind of, I guess, magnified for you where you sit with regard, again, to the specific cultural sector and the issues they were encountering and grappling with?
Well, the biggest one was, I think people, at least in the big cities that I'm mostly focused on, primarily Tokyo, but other cities as well, no one really realized how much they were relying on tourists. In the case of Tokyo, I think tourists mostly from Asia drive a good 30 to 40% of spend and traffic for any downtown venue. So it was a good opportunity, I guess, to look at the domestic market, and a lot of money was being spent on trying to drive international visitors, which is a good thing, but there's a renewed focus on the local market. The other thing was maybe what we are working in Ginza 6, which is a shopping center partially owned by the El Carreton LVMH group, but we have a really huge atrium that our firm helps curate for every year. We have a relatively large budget where we basically hang a piece of art, which is several tons and which is quite large. The mall itself is an entire 2 city blocks, and the atrium is probably like half of that, so it's quite large. But even if you want to work with an international artist, and you're spending, almost $1 million on it, if you're not sure if the artist can actually show up or if the art can even arrive on FedEx, like I've ordered pots online, and they said Amazon told me they would arrive in 2 weeks. It's been like 3 months, right? So there's this shipping uncertainty, which is partially or largely driven by the crisis. So we couldn't work with artists. We decided to just scratch off artists who are abroad or whose works would have to come from abroad, but it's forced everyone to think creatively. So digital printing for art is not something people were that happy to embrace before, but now out of necessity, everyone is looking into digitally printing the art here locally instead of trying to ship it. And that's driven some interesting, actually new opportunities. So I think in the midst of crises, there's always, it forces you to innovate. And that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah.
Can I say something? Can I add something here, Michael?
Please.
It's such a good point. And in fact, what I think is really interesting about this is that by forcing us to think local rather than international, we're addressing climate change. So instead of shipping, should we be shipping artworks around the world at great cost to the environment? One thing that's happened in Australia, and I've been banging on about this for years, is that international museums love to send couriers. You know, how cool to get to go to Sydney for a week, right? Complete scam in my view. Well, in COVID, guess what? It couldn't happen. And guess what? It didn't matter. So the National Gallery in Australia actually did all their conditioning checking with their conservators and Zoom. And the conservator back in, I've forgotten which museum it was, back in Europe, looking at the artworks on Zoom. And so far, we don't seem to have any problem. Funny that. So I think stopping people flying around the world, I mean, it's a real problem for Australians because, of course, we need to travel to see and to meet artists and so on. But there are a lot of other things that, in my view, were superfluous. And I think that what Theo's just mentioned about digital printing, thinking about how you can actually produce things here. Our next Biennale of Sydney is going to be a landmark. Jose Roca from Colombia, who moved here before the pandemic, is determined that this will have a very low footprint. And of course, biennales are famous for flying artists and artworks all over the world. So I do think this is a really important and positive change that we're going to see work through the sector.
Absolutely. Appreciate you stepping in there. Shauna, welcome back. Sorry about your internet issues. We're happy to have you back. I know you're
welcome to Western Australia.
I know your introduction was cut short, but I feel your introduction kind of segues into what we're talking about now and some of the major, you know, the pressing pain points we've been talking about and what you really experience, I think, especially in your role in central to communications and programming. I'd love to have you speak a little bit about that, about navigating these challenges with so many moving parts for you that aren't centralized or have a hub really other than you in the middle there.
Yeah, well, it kind of matches what Lisanne actually was saying and Theo about that whole international construct as well. So we have a similar problem, except that in our case, it's actually humans that we need to move around. We actually, like, our entire existence is predicated on live performance. So what do you do then? And it comes back to that, what have you got locally? What can you do locally? But there is a desire to push out. There's always going to be that bigger intent to connect. So for us, it was, there was all these federal and state grant options going around so that people would create content. They just tried to keep people working. And all of our organisations were going in for funding to get digital cameras or to do these digital presentations, which probably was the space people were moving into anyway, but they hadn't really spent enough time there. So it became quite obvious that digital presentation of a show can't just be one camera pointed at the stage and doing it the same way you've always done it. It's not interesting to the audience. It's not that experience. So what we did was we said, well, what if Perth Theatre Trust picked up the digital cameras? What if we buy all of those things for each of our venues so that if someone comes in, they can create that experience. And then we have that digital product, but it's at a quality that we actually can still send it on. And for WA, being a bit of an island in an island, it's also about how do we relate to our national people as well. And by us picking that up, by us taking that on and using the government sort of resources to underpin that, what that's going to do is upskill our staff. It's going to upskill the industry. They're not all having to buy their own equipment. But when we do go back out and start doing things live, which, you know, of course is always going to be our intent, we'll have product that can show you what we're touring, of a quality that you can actually see what you would be buying. So there's a whole new opportunity in there that came out of, oh my gosh, we can't show this to anybody. What do we do next? So that's been a real opportunity for us.
No, absolutely. And I think, you know, the other day we were also talking about sort of communication between these parties as well, right? Not just kind of not leaving them to navigate these situations on their own, but rather really providing support. So how do centralized, core teams, leadership teams, et cetera, choreograph support externally, whether it's within MCA Sydney, right, to the departments, or, Theo working with your clients around the world, or Shauna with all of your different theater groups, et cetera? Shauna, I'd love for you to start by, how does communications and collaboration work into kind of providing that confidence, or that, not only are you guys providing certain resources, but that, and then I'd love for Lizanne to speak a little bit to how did you all communicate your guys' efforts externally, and what were the kind of marketing efforts behind that? But Shauna, please speak a little to maybe the challenges you initially faced, but then what happened through COVID that you saw with your organizations, the decentralized network.
Sure. I think the big thing for us was working out that you don't actually have to be the leader. You don't actually have to have all the solutions. And we have all of these wonderful producers that exist, whether they're a company or whether they're independents or small to mediums. There were all these theatre makers who existed around us, and they were being funded to create art. But then what happens then? You sort of like, you've made all of this, you've made this product during this downtime. So our offer at that point was, well, we have these venues. We're already being supported by government to kind of exist. What if we waived all the venue costs? What if you come in here and start just mucking around and see how you go? So there was this real opportunity for experimentation. And one of the local companies, a group called Performing Lines, who work with independent artists, they really picked that up, and they said, well, what if we took on this whole hub at one of your centres? And they took over, it's a very small it's a capital city space, but it's quite a small suburban art centre. And all these independent artists took that space over for a period of 3 weeks and just started to familiarise themselves with venues. They got, there was mentoring, they were doing seminars. And what has come out of that is they really enjoyed working with each other. Independent artists weren't really getting a chance to cross over with themselves or cross over with larger organisations. So that's actually something we're still doing. So at this very moment in time, they're doing a second version of that, even though we're not in lockdown anymore, even though we're not in the same situation, because the value of that, the value of us taking on the responsibility of the venue and all of the things that take up time, and they've got financial imposts that no one could cover. By picking up those sorts of risks, they've managed to be able to start to work actually in a much more collaborative way. So there's all of this collaboration that's happening just as a result of the fact that for a while they couldn't actually collaborate. And we've moved that into a bigger space now. So say when we go into lockdowns or when we go through periods of high intensity COVID, they'll sometimes reduce the number of people we can have in the theatres. So it might go up to 50%, it might go up to 100%, drop back down. So we've now changed all of our financial modelling around venue hire to match that. So if you're at a 50% capacity, you're only going to pay 50% of what our venue costs would normally be. And then on top of that, the government's also done what's called sharing the risk, and they've picked up some of that responsibility. So a company, if they want to hire a venue but are really worried about COVID coming in and wiping out their show and that really big financial risk that sits there, that's been picked up by government, who say, well, if you were expecting to get an audience of 60% and then COVID shuts that down, we guarantee that income if that happens. So between the venue and the government funding and the arts companies really coming to the table, there's been a really big shift in collaboration and generosity of spirit, I think, is what's coming out of that.
That's really great to hear, and definitely necessary. I think we've experienced that at Y ourselves. from all the, you know, whether it's institutional support going one way or another, or even working with the smaller galleries or some of the event spaces that we've been lucky to be a part of. Definitely see that collaboration has come to the forefront in all of this. I do want to touch on so many things, but with so many questions, not so many, but questions coming through and us kind of running out of time, I do want to look towards the future as well, right? And Lizanne, you spoke about a lot of things that you guys had already started working on, and now that people are coming back into this space, what you guys maintain focus on. You know, for you all, especially you, right? You said you didn't want, you came in with it financially struggling. You weren't going to leave it financially struggling. So for you right now, what would you prioritize as a cultural institution with regards to what you would invest in to solidify right now in this effort as we get back into the flow of things? You know, what does reinvention look like, and how does that translate to resiliency, as in kind of what you're feeding into?
Well,
right now?
A really good friend of mine, and I must credit her, Caroline Christophe Bukharjiev, said something I thought was quite wonderful when I was talking to her. She said she thinks it's a bit like the slow food movement in Italy. It's local, it's quality produce, it's not fast food. You have to take time, and it's not mass. Now, I think all of us in the museum world, and I'm as bad as anyone, you know, I'm happy to trumpet that we became the most tide attended, blah, 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 blah in the world. However, I think post-COVID, we have an opportunity to reset how we think and what we mean by audience engagement. And I'm not suggesting that we should give up on wanting lots of people through. That's not it at all. But the way in which we deepen that engagement with art and artists, to me, is what is actually going to be critical. And so slowing viewers down, moving against the idea of instant gratification, instant spectacle, the idea of having people come in their lunch hour, listen to something, look at something that helps their well-being. I really believe that this idea that the arts, in particular, in my case, the visual arts, but all of the arts, can contribute to creating a more healthy society and to help us get beyond the crisis. Also by obviously the obvious things like tourism and getting people back in the cities and regenerating businesses by we're doing late nights in order to, you know, attract people to stay in the city on a Friday. All that is incredibly important. But the thing that really matters for me is that deepening engagement bit. And I think that is because as a museum, we have been at the forefront of working with artists to demonstrate the value of creative thinking and creative learning. And that goes right across the spectrum. And I think as we move into a different era where jobs are going to be very different, where there's going to be all this AI doing all the jobs, the need for creativity, critical thinking, resilience, empathy, all these things that this artist educator team of ours do around the wellness agenda is what I think is super, super exciting and a real change, a real sea change in our thinking, and requires a completely different way of thinking how we value the arts. So it's, I'm leaving on a big agenda, but I think it's a very important one.
No, absolutely. And I think, Theo, you know, I mean, one of the things that's important about all of this is a lot of these changes are kind of principle changes and operational changes and things like this. Theo, I mean, from your standpoint, how does this translate then to kind of making sure this stuff is solidified commercially or financially, right? From your standpoint, what sort of new things can maybe the cultural sector, knowing that they have this great kind of breakthrough, right, in this last year of the priorities, these are the things we need to focus on, as Lizanne was speaking about. What are the opportunities for the cultural sector to look externally for collaboration in solidifying these things and making sure that, you know, people like the people on this panel and people listening in are really institutionalizing these changes in a positive way that allows for a kind of sustainability moving forward?
Well, I can think of a number of things, like the nighttime thing that Lizanne just touched upon. I mean, a lot of people are doing it, but if you look at the total picture of museums or cultural centers which have a solid nighttime program, it is minuscule. I would say it's less than 5%. Because at the end of the day, they're they operate like a government office, like they close at 5 and they go home. And yet, if you look at, most working class people, they work in the day. Even in this, digital age, people are more or less, more busy in the daytime. So this, the 24-hour economy is something we're researching right now for a project. We're trying to create a 24-hour city, but what does that actually mean? You can't just have bars open that night. You need to have the cultural part open at night, because a lot of people now have flexible schedules, or they only have time at night. So why should culture be in the exclusive domain of the day? I think that needs to change. The other thing is funding. I think you need to draw a line as to the what your purpose is and the integrity of that purpose. But ultimately, for the private sector, authenticity drives interest and traffic. So if you have an authentic art program that the private sector can work with, I think there is a lot more room for collaboration there. Pop-ups, museum pop-ups in shopping centers. I noticed NGV does that with Chadston in Australia. They have a cows exhibition at the museum, and they did a pop-up in the mall for families with kids. And that, I think, is a win-win. The cultural pedigree that NGV brings to Chadston helps the mall and its standing in the subconscious of the consumer, but it also drives interest from people who maybe normally would just go to the mall and says, hey, my kids are really interested in art. I should go and take them to the museum next week. This is a win-win to me, and something that could be really, really expanded exponentially if everyone was trying to do that more. So those are two examples, I think, of some immediate stuff that could be done on both ends.
No, that's wonderful. And then I think this is a good time to include one of the questions that actually Shauna beat me to it in answering by by Carissa Lim. She asked, with core income sources lost during lockdown, did you manage to find alternative revenue and income sources apart from public sector funding? And if so, how and have you managed to retain them? I think we've already touched on this in some ways, but Shauna, why don't you start by kind of reiterating what you wrote in the Q&A, and then I'd love to kind of hear from the rest of you all as well on that front.
Yeah, so for us, you can imagine we lost the venue hire, we lose the ability to rentals that we had coming in across COVID. It's quite difficult, but what has been one of the new income streams is definitely moving into a digital ticketing market so that we can actually monetize stream performance, which was not something that we had really moved into before. So even if the ticketing money is going to a different organisation, we still are getting the fees for that. So our ticketing team, who have nearly killed themselves across this period, they have had to make an audience be 100%, then make an audience be 50%. And now we've also said, well, also can you digitise that as well? So they've actually been the heroes of the hour, I think. And I've mentioned this in the post, we're now reaching an audience we've never reached before. So there is a whole accessibility issue there. There's a access for people who don't like to go out at night, for people who can't access our theatres, particularly our heritage, which are not accessible, and people who've never actually set foot inside a theatre, and that comes with attendant issues as well. So that's a real opportunity for us, and we're developing that more and more.
Yeah, and Liz, you mentioned, obviously you've touched on a lot of these things already, but the venue for hire one, I think in particular, is there an alternative to fill such a sizable gap, or is that just something that you have to substantiate in other ways?
Well, I think it is quite an irony that the organisations that diversified like this, if I look at the UK, for example, if you look at Tate, which, you know, expanded, did regional venues and diversified its income, versus the National Gallery, which didn't, we know which one is in a better state right now. You know, we were held up as a great role model, and in fact, our role model in COVID was deeply flawed, but because of a thing that nobody could ever have anticipated. I don't think there is any alternative to that. However, I should point out that the other thing that happened to us was a huge increase in philanthropy. So our philanthropists really stood up when they saw what was happening. Not completely, it was government money that really filled the gap, but to a large extent. And I do believe that arts organizations, it is all about partnership. It's not about saying it has to be government. It has to be saying, well, if you give us a bit of money for late nights, for example, we'll match it from sponsorship or philanthropy. So that's the kind of strategy that we're adopting going forward. We can't ever replace venues, and it's coming back. It will come back. It'll come back, you know, slowly. I mean, people still want to get married, and the MC is still a great venue. So we are getting weddings. We just need the whole. We need the end of this of the closures and so on, which it needs to happen when we're all vaccinated and we can see a clear path out of it, and then there'll be much more confidence. But certainly our bookings are way up for the end of the year. We're projecting much better than we had anticipated, so it's coming back.
Yeah, Theo, are you going to say
Michael,
something? I was about to point to you.
We haven't cracked the digital money thing, I have to say. I don't think many people in the visual arts have. I think it's a very different thing.
Theo?
Yeah, I was going to say, if you look at traffic and engagement right now and retail and restaurant spend, in most cities where the vaccination rate has gone over 50%, it's actually higher than 2019 numbers. So there's this sort of pent up, you know, demand that's going to explode over the next 2 to 3 years.
Yeah.
What we need to be careful, everybody in every industry, is a sense of complacency that arises from surprisingly good numbers in business. Because everything's going to be fine for a while, but the underlying issues that we were all facing are still there. But they may be even hidden by this momentary jump and this pent-up frustration and demand. But the underlying issues that we have to challenge in the mid to long term will still remain. So I think it's actually, hey, we need to be actually mindful of that next year when things are going to be really good.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
One thing I can talk about is humans love exclusivity. Now, exclusivity, the term goes against the very nature of, I think, public museums, and especially museums which are taking the money of the public. So I think it needs to be carefully done. But we in this pandemic have been experimenting with sort of ownership, this feeling of ownership where people can maybe donate or support, but get something a little more personalized in return. And I think everybody's doing that to varying degrees, but that could be probably explored a bit more, as in organize a bit better exclusive events or talks, even a sit down with an artist we've found, and digitally on top of that, but with a personalized touch, like everybody gets a autographed something in the mail, or some personalized message, a personal tour of the museum. People want to be treated specially. And I think that sort of recognizing that, and I think that wouldn't come up with the $5 million deficit in, for example, a venues business, but it could certainly add up, and something I think which would be important to diversify the income stream.
That's sorry, but
no, please, Shauna, please.
it's a really similar thing to what we've discovered. We're almost the rate at which people have gone back to normal is quite stupendous. We don't have the vaccination, but because everyone feels safe, it's business as usual. But what Theo is talking about has actually happened in the performing arts as well. And that offer of, even when we go back to full live performance, the digital offer, the extra bit, the backstage tour, here's the costume, all that really incredible richness around the performance, talking to the artistic director, what does contemporary dance mean, all of that stuff. And it's interesting that some of that is actually, we've been doing for years in the accessibility space, audio description, trying to engage with people in different ways. And actually, it's not only for people with disabilities, it's actually a really human connection. And so that extra offer, that extra piece is, yeah, it really helps to sell. So we were worried that would people move to the digital platform and never come back to live performance? But actually what they're looking for is the double offer, is that little piece extra that's for them, a gift.
Yeah. And I'm going to contradict what I said earlier, because we have done it in a small way. So for example, our art and dementia program, we've created a toolkit and we're selling it online. And it's flying out off the internet. It's just been incredible. It's for carers looking, people with early onset dementia. And we've trialed it with St. Luke's in partnership, and it's been hugely successful. So I do think that, but you need the resources in the first place. So there's not exactly, the business model isn't quite right, because you can't just transfer the incredible work that the team do in our learning studio and put it online. You actually have to create a completely different product. Particularly for these vulnerable groups, but there is definitely a market there. And once we can tie in Hammond Care and all the aged care centres, then I think we'll start to make real money out of it. My problem is, I think that there's a lot of assumptions that you just turn stuff digital, and actually it's not that easy, and it makes money. And we're having this conversation in the task force at the moment, because there is actually a subgroup looking at this very topic.
Michael, in Ginza 6, we've done this sort of hybrid where we have like a three-part experience. One of the two is done digitally, and then it sort of climaxes with a physical in-person event or experience. So I think, just like with Zoom, right? Some Zooms can, we realize some meetings can be done on Zoom and 100% as effective as a meeting in person, whilst the more important ones have to be done in person. And I think the same could be done. You could sort of craft a digital, physical, hybrid model for a lot of what people do at museums.
No, I think that's right. I was interested in delving more into details surrounding digital, but that might be a whole different conversation. There was a great question from Sonia Pinheiro, who said to Shauna, but I do want to pose this to everyone. She said, PTT also manages public spaces. Have the priorities shifted in relation to the management of the public realm, especially in taking into account health and public risks? Now, I want to have Shauna, you answer that. But to Lizanne and Theo, speaking of the public realm, how about shared space? How about organizations that are immediately around you in your communities or in your neighborhoods? How do you all work together to build that sort of district feel, right? That facilitates people to come and enjoy this larger space around you guys to continue to build up presence in that area. But I think, Shauna, since that was directed to you, if you don't, being cognizant of time, as we only have 10 minutes left, if you'd like to touch on that just briefly, and then I'd love to Lizanne and Theo, you guys to speak a little bit about public realm as well.
Yep, so they have changed. It is about people moving and not stopping. So we're actively trying to not create what you'd normally be doing in a public space, is actually getting people to stay and enjoy and wait. And what we've actually been sort of challenged by is, how do you move them through? You still give them that experience in some way, but you don't congregate. So that has been a big thing. The Perth Festival did an incredible job, and that might be something that someone wants to look at, the projections that they did across the Perth Cultural Centre for the 2021 Perth Festival. And they were on buildings, but they were done in 15-minute dashes so that people would keep moving around the space and wouldn't actually interact in the same way with each other. It was all about giving them that experience, but not having them congregate in space.
Lizanne, how has this impacted? I mean, not even in response to COVID necessarily. I think just looking forward, as you guys strategize, how has this, if at all, impacted how you approach the public realm outside of the museum and kind of the shared space?
Well, we see ourselves having a very big role in addressing this problem of the CBD, which is everybody working from home. And every single time I have a sponsors meeting, it's the one thing they say: we want to get our workers back in the office. What incentives can we give them? Now, coming to a museum after work could be seen as an incentive, particularly for younger people. We have a great terrace. So we've been running a program collaborating with other arts organizations. So there's moments of dance, moments of poetry, and moments of theatre within the galleries, responding to the artworks. And then, of course, you have the terrace, and we've linked up with local businesses. So they provide us with cocktails. So we show off and encourage the people who are in the museum to then go on for dinner or cocktails or whatever in the rocks. So it's very much seeing ourselves as part of that, which is exactly what Theo's talking about, that animation of the city. And particularly with companies, it's got a financial upside because companies want to see those things, want those things for their employees. So they're very keen to see these kinds of things happening. I'm talking about the companies around us in the CBD in particular. So I think there is a really important role for culture to play, exactly as Theo was saying, that people want to go to shopping centres, but they also might quite like a bit of culture. So the two things are certainly not mutually exclusive. And it's going to be very interesting to see if we can continue this kind of pace, because it is very resource heavy, of course. And to Theo's point about staying open late, yes, we'd all love to stay open late. We'd all love to be open much later and more often, but it does come down to money, because it's not as simple as opening at 12 and shutting at 9. The costs of opening later are much greater, and you actually have to activate the spaces in order to encourage people to come. So it's not as simple as just saying there's a great exhibition. You actually people now need these events, they need these stimulus if you're asking them to do something in the evening. So it's a very different kind of way of consuming culture between, say, what I would call the lunchtime audience coming from the CBD and the evening audience coming from the CBD. There's very different expectations. And I think that's something we really have to be aware of.
Yep.
I wonder if museums realize that there's a potentially very lucrative consulting business for them. Because we're working with a world top 5 property developer. They have an extended mixed-use development. By extended, I mean it's a quite large and sprawling development. You need, Lizanne was talking about this sort of getting people to keep moving. But there are bits and portions of this development that they are paying a museum to come in to basically be a tenant, and that the cultural element will drive more people to the entire district. But now we're talking, in yesterday's phone call we had with them, they're now asking the museum to take over some of the public space. What this means is basically the property developer is saying, you probably know better than us how to basically use public space for the greater good. But ultimately that will bring more people, and more people means more money. So, I mean, I think museums actually have an opportunity in advising the private sector on how to animate, activate outdoor space, for example. Indoor space, of course, as well, but outdoor space. And that could be a very lucrative money, because they pay me, but you probably know better than me how to do that. So
Yes, we have a partnership with one of our developers here called Top Spring to do, and in fact they're developing a block of apartments, and they're going to offer all the people who buy the apartments a top level membership at the MCA. So it's, I'm not so sure that it's very interesting you say that, because our experience is though that they don't recognize the value in a monetary sense in the way that they would someone like you, Theo. So it's a conversation I'd really love to have further with you, because it may be the way we're presenting it, but we find there's a bit of resistance to actually paying us for this kind of thing. They think we should do it almost for nothing. So it's a very interesting thing.
I think it's changing very rapidly as they realize. And actually, it's a very interesting thing. We're trying to find different ways. I'm using very smart interns here for the summer from various economic universities and to try to quantify that a little more as to how cultural content ultimately drives more traffic and money.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
I think without
I think everyone here wants to see that study.
Exactly.
Maybe I should sell it. But what I'm trying to say is that there is a very quickly changing perception. The private sector is more and more realizing that they need cultural content to raise the value, even with brands, right? Louis Vuitton, all of these luxury brands have historically associated themselves with culture and art, ultimately to sell their handbags at an extremely a high premium. But that's now what property and developments are doing, because they know it drives the image, but it also drives traffic. So to them, I think there's a very rapidly changing, I mean, in Japan, guys in salaryman suits are realizing that. So globally, it's definitely happening.
Yeah. We're about to run out, and I don't want to cut it off here. We're about 5 minutes. I did want to just allow everyone, we've answered most of the questions, and give you all, the panelists, an opportunity for kind of a closing remark, whether it's something you guys want to respond to something that's already been said, or just looking forward. What are you guys the most excited about with regards to the opportunities presented by the current circumstances and what's unfolding? So, but Sean, it seemed like you were about to say something, so why don't you go ahead and start, and we can keep going.
Well, it's more a response to what Theo was saying, because and I don't know how universal this is, but there's a percent for art scheme that sits within the government here, and it's 10% of any bill over $1 million has got to be spent on public art associated with that building, because they've realised that the buildings, if you don't add art to them, they're a little bit ugly sometimes. They've got no life. They've got no. So it's also that thing of getting government to understand that what art gives a space can transform it completely. For us, with our public realm, we're in the really lucky position that we're actually surrounded by cultural institutions. We have a museum, we have the art gallery, we have the State Library, we have a contemporary art gallery, the Perth Institute of Contemporary Art, and State Theatre Centre. So there's all of this talent sitting there, and I think that's the next opportunity for us. And the really exciting thing is, as people start to come back out, how do we engage better?
Oh no. Oh, sorry, you froze for a second.
Oh, I was just going to say it's about working better with the cultural institutions. So for me, it's all about the next level of collaboration, which is different from anything we've had before.
Theo, do you have any closing thoughts or remarks?
Yeah, it's not quite a closing remark, but in response to Shauna in return, one thing we're looking into right now, a lot of developments spend a lot of money, put in public art, and then it's promptly forgotten forever. And I'm trying to quantify that if there is a program which is publicly or privately funded, I don't really care ultimately, but there's a program of regular change that will drive people to come back and see what's changed, because they need something to put on their Instagram. So this is something that is probably welcomed by everybody on this call, right? a program of constantly changing and updated. And then you can recycle stuff because you can move it from point A to point B and have a revolving program across Perth or Sydney or even across your state. But let's keep things fresh because no one's going to look. We're trying to do this, quantify this experiment where if someone sees something every day, they don't see it anymore after a while. They literally, it's scary. Like you will not notice something. But if it changes, you kind of stop and realize something's changed. So I think that's something we should all actually look into and propose for a more vibrant, changing public arts program.
Well, and I think this is something that we should definitely keep the conversation going on a different thread. I spoke to Greg about putting together an email or even hosting a conversation after this over the next few weeks, which I will be doing. So please keep an eye out for that. We'll speak specifically to that topic as well. I think encourage that. But thank you, Theo and Shauna. Lizanne, is there anything that you'd like to kind of
just quickly in response to that? I'm someone who was famous for once saying I wanted to start the public art demolition squad because I think so much of it is so awful, and that actually mandating 1% for art has been a disaster. So on another topic, I do believe that what we're learning from the pandemic is I actually think that finally the actual value of the arts is becoming much clearer, and that we are able to articulate that better, and that certainly in this country, we've seen our politicians being much more open to it. I think we've seen large interventions around the world. Of course, there's still a lot of problems. Artists are not by any means out of the woods and have suffered greatly during this, but I do think that there is a real recognition, and therefore that gives us in the arts a great opportunity to really push home what it is that the arts does, the impact, the social impact, the bringing together of people, the sense of community, the community building, all those things we all know about. I think we're finally getting the message through. So I'm leaving the museum on a very optimistic note.
And that's such an optimistic note to end this round table as well. I just would like to first and foremost thank Greg and Sue Fern for GCDN for hosting this, but more so Lizanne, Shauna, Theo. What a great conversation, vibrant conversation, and a conversation that will keep going after this. And I think everyone, we will be sharing contact information to facilitate further conversation, but also I will be making sure that Y will host an ongoing conversation speaking to some of those kind of hot topics at the very end. Unfortunately, at the very end of this conversation that were brought to the forefront. But Greg, thank you so much for having us.
No, thank you. That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you also very much for sharing your thoughts and for engaging. I love the chemistry on this panel. So thank you very, very much for that. I'll see you all very soon. Do take care.
Thank you all.
Wherever you are.
Thank you, Theo. Thank you, Shauna.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.